Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. I know I have not posted in a while. This is because I've been trying to learn more about severe weather and winter weather before forecasting it more, as I'm more used to tropical weather, so I've been wanting to focus on learning it more. So in the future I will be updating for stuff like that. But also it did not get a lot of views, so I didn't really know if y'all wanted to see more of that because not many of y'all watch that. But I know that I'm a largely tropical channel, so today it's going to be my first official 2025 hurricane season forecast. Obviously, Colorado State University also released their forecast today. I was going to post this back in March, but honestly, nothing changed really back in March. But since then, a lot more info has come out. So without further ado, let's get started. So this is going to be my first official one. The last one I did in February was my preliminary one. So it wasn't like my official forecast. It was just like an early estimate. Anyway, let's go. Oops, went too far. Anyway, so let's start with the mid-March IRI ENSO probabilities. So really what we're going to be seeing for the most part is, here, let's mark this 50%, is for the early season, by the way, this is March. So for the early season, June, July area, it's mainly going to be a neutral. And as we get into August and September, it's really going to stay the same neutral until peak season, but like a cool neutral, which is going to slightly favor the Atlantic. And then maybe in October or late season, we can get into a La Nina a bit. There's also growing chances of an El Nino. It is the lowest chance, but because there's considerable El Nino, La Nina, and neutral probabilities as far out, it just shows that the peak to later season, we are kind of unsure on what's going to happen, and I just circled there the months I'm talking about. So a neutral to La Nina, the effects of that: less wind shear and higher sea surface temperatures overall. Now, it's again a neutral. It's kind of like in the middle, like it really could go either way, but usually neutrals favor the Atlantic still a little bit, at least in a cool neutral. Anyway, so the next thing is the observed AMO index. By the way, guys, sorry if it takes a second for me to switch slides at all. Sometimes my keyboard just doesn't like to work. Anyway, observed AMO index. So what the AMO index is basically it shows like long-term sea surface temperature anomalies for the Atlantic. So they go from around 50 to 70 years in length. So since we started taking records to the early 1900s, we are in a warm phase, which means the Atlantic is overall warmer than usual for like 70 years, or like the anomaly is that the Atlantic is going to be warmer for 70 years, which favors more Atlantic activity. So we had more Atlantic activity in this period. Now, 1900s to around 1930, it was a cool phase. So what that meant is like we had cooler Atlantic temperatures overall, less activity, as well as maybe weaker systems. But this mainly has to do with activity and such. But it can also do with intensity, depending on the season. But that one's a little more iffy. But anyway, to the 30s to the 70s, we had a warm phase and then the cool phase again. But since around the 90s, we've had a warm phase, and we're still very well in that warm phase. So that's going to favor warmer Atlantic temperatures and higher sea surface temperatures and more activity. And so and other factors are going to determine obviously how strong they could be, because obviously like 2022, very active season, but not many became hurricanes. So this more has to do with pure activity. But this favors a more active season. And I guess that's also shown by the fact that we haven't had a below average season in, say, like 10 years. So next, we're talking so much about sea surface temperatures with ENSO and AMO index. Let's actually look at them. So 26 degrees Celsius is what you need for a hurricane. So this past, that is hurricane. That's 74 mile per hour plus, and that's what they can thrive on. So much of the Atlantic doesn't have this, but we see the Gulf Loop, which is very warm already, the Caribbean and the southern MDR, very warm temperatures, already at 26 or above, meaning that obviously this isn't going to happen in April, just due to other reasons. But somehow, if we did get a low here, the waters would be warm enough to make it a hurricane if somehow every other thing was in place. Above this, waters aren't warm enough for a hurricane, but they could be for a tropical storm, say, or a tropical depression. Obvious, and then you got like 21 degrees, which is like all the way up here, and that's where subtropical storms can form. And extratropical cyclones aren't actually tropical cyclones. They're not named or anything. We don't track them, but unless obviously they're hitting land and it's like a northeaster or something. But and subtropical cyclones are hard to track, and they're like obviously they don't happen very often, except maybe in the later seasons from remnants of tropical cyclones. But anyway, I'm going off track here. Basically, it's warm enough to have subtropical cyclones in this region, but obviously we're not forecasting that. We're forecasting tropical cyclones. I mean, they're still named, but they're confusing. We don't have them that often. Anyway, so tropical storms could probably form to this latitude around 22, 23 degrees Celsius. But in this Caribbean area, hurricanes, category 1 to 5, and I'm drawing this out because I like to draw stuff out, so don't judge me. But yeah, hurricane water's already there. Like, water's warm enough for hurricanes. Now, again, 26 degrees Celsius. This shows the depths of those hurricane favorable waters. So you see in the MDR, we're not as much there. We're not there yet. And obviously, you can't really just have a hurricane on only like 30 feet of this water, because obviously it's going to cool it down pretty quickly, the hurricane, and then it's not favorable enough for it. But you see 100 meters, 300 feet in parts of the MDR, in the Western MDR, the Caribbean, and into the Gulf Loop. The Gulf Loop is already looking strong. So those bigger depths of like 150 to 300 feet, that could support a hurricane. So that is definitely something to watch. Obviously it doesn't happen in April. And obviously, like, down here, we don't really have stuff down here that's way too south. Sorry. But in the Central Caribbean and the Gulf Loop, like, already, if, again, this doesn't happen in April, but if everything else came together, if you could have a low pressure come through here and become a 74 mile per hour plus hurricane. And then obviously maybe the waters surrounding here, not as warm, maybe could favor a tropical storm of sorts. Now, the water is already warmer than usual. Obviously, we're talking about, like, or the water's already warm enough to support hurricane in a lot of the Atlantic and such. But to actually compare this to other years, this is right now, we're like at least sorry, I lost my train of thought. At least right now, we're going way warmer than usual. The AMO forecast, and all except like difficulty keeping up with the intense warm phase. So we are going way warmer than usual. Like, so this is the forecast, and this is the observed. Now this is this dotted line the forecast, and then this black line is the observed. Now this isn't saying it's going to drop off. It's saying that the analogs that we're using for this hurricane season and that are predicting the sea surface temperatures way above it at levels like just way above, which can favor more activity. You see 2023 to 2025, 2022 to 2024, very active hurricane seasons. So really, we're staying well above that warm threshold, and really what we could be seeing here is much warmer waters than expected. Again, we're already having hurricane water temps, which is unusual for at least how widespread it is for this time of year, if that makes sense. It's just so much of the Atlantic is already so warm. And we can see this here going into the peak of hurricane season, August, September, and October, where subtropics are very warm, and this area is not very, I'm pretty sure it's due to a weakening Gulf Stream, but I honestly couldn't tell you that because I haven't looked too much into it. But if any of y'all are interested, maybe I'll make a video on it someday. Anyway, so we see the warmest waters in the Gulf. You see those deeper colors there, especially that Gulf Loop, and as well as parts of a lot of the open Atlantic. But especially, I'm going to focus on the subtropics here for a second. So that could mean that tropical storms or subtropical storms, but mainly tropical storms. So tropical storms that go through this area before becoming like extra tropical up here, when they're still tropical, they could like feed on that, become even hurricanes before going up into the jet stream and fading away. But no matter the case, that could fuel storms up here. But overall, most of the activity, obviously, we don't really see it up here. It's way down here. We see widespread above average sea surface temperatures favoring these storms, development and even strengthening. So my sea surface temperatures forecast below average for parts of the subtropics, like on the coast as you saw, but also most of the Atlantic where all the activity is, because we don't really get it up here, and even up here we don't really get it that much, but above average sea surface temperatures for most of the Atlantic, especially the Caribbean into that Gulf loop and parts of the subtropics, and even just regular tropics near Bermuda off the coast of the Carolinas, where we're going to have the most above average sea surface temperatures favoring storm development and strengthening in these two areas, but also again just Atlantic wide. Now moving on to shear. This is June, July, August average, and actually this is just the average. So in a couple of these months, there's like way less shear. Like you see these darker colors signifying extremely less shear. Like I think for like August, it shows like those deep colors around this whole entire area. So just very little shear though. I mean, they might have some problems initially coming out of Africa, but they almost immediately go into some below average shear. So really, what we're going to be seeing is very favorable conditions for storm development, and the shear can help with, and the little shear really it helps with storms actually being able to develop, because a lot of times the shear is a problem because then the storms can't actually even develop to at least like a tropical storm or hurricane, like it doesn't even get there because of the shear. But this below average shear, the storms will have a much easier time developing in the Caribbean, in the Gulf, and even out to sea, but especially like off the coast of Africa where they really encounter that shear the most. And again, this is just early season. But also later on when it's actually developed, like a lot of times you'll have systems say they will, just to show y'all here, they'll like be in the Caribbean or the Gulf and they'll have tons of warm waters when they're tracking through there, but there's just so much shear feeding into the Caribbean that the waters are warm enough for them to become like some major hurricane or rapidly intensified, but they just can't because of that shear. So not only is this going to help storm development, but it's going to really help storms strengthen if due to below average shear. Now, obviously, there's going to be times where there is shear. This isn't saying there's not going to be any shear, but it's going to mean there's going to be a lot less shear, which means storms will have an easier time developing into tropical storms, and then some of those will have an easier time becoming hurricanes and maybe even rapidly intensifying into major hurricanes. So, and we also have above average shear for the the Eastern Pacific, but obviously that's not what this video is about. So yeah. And now we're going to go to peak season, where August, September, October, where we do have pretty much the same thing, but actually, sorry, I just plugged in my computer because I don't want it to die while making a video. Sorry if y'all heard that sound. Anyway, moving on. Below average shear, still even more below average for the Caribbean and the Gulf, Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico, whatever you want to call it. And then, again, the same here in the parts of the MDR. Now, we still might have some trouble with lows coming off, but later on they will be able to get their act together. And due to the abundance of below average shear here, and because even if coming off the coast, while they might be exposed to a lot of shear, they'll almost immediately leave it, according to this. So really, while it might inhibit storm development a little bit due to the rest of the Atlantic not having as much, the storms might be able to recover and it really won't affect them as much. So definitely a lot of storms still developing. And we have above average shear in the Southern Caribbean, but honestly, below this line, like there are some storms that go through here, but other than that, they don't really go this far down. Again, that's more south than usual. I mean, we don't have hurricanes down here or tropical storms, but yeah. So my wind shear forecast, above average for the southern MDR into maybe like to the Bay of Campeche. But really, it doesn't really matter. We don't get really a lot of storms down there because as soon as the low pressures leave maybe a little bit of the MDR, maybe I could like push this blue over a little bit and put some red here because there is going to be above average here immediately off the coast. But as soon as they leave that, they're going to go into very favorable below average shear environments, especially in the northern MDR out to sea, and especially near the Gulf, Northern Caribbean, and parts of the Gulf Stream. So really, above average sea surface temperatures and this below average shear, not only are they going to be systems actually going to be able to form together, act together, but they're going to be able to feed on very warm sea surface temperatures without the inhibitions of shear, allowing them to strengthen. And that leads into rapid intensification. I'm going to make sure I didn't miss a slide here. Okay. Rapid intensification hotspots. So, due to the little inhibition that many storms aren't, like, due to the little shear and the little inhibitions against the storms will be able to rapidly intensify in some places. So, based on the models and just based on where hurricanes usually track, if they can get over warm waters long enough, these are the three areas they may rapidly intensify in. So, off the coast of the Leeward Islands in Puerto Rico, if a storm could track through here, we have had storms that like go from tropical storm to like a strong hurricane around here. I think Dorian strengthens a lot near here. It might have been a different storm. But anyway, that's still unsure. This likely chance here, as you saw, there was abundance of sea surface temperatures around here on the climatology models, as well as very little shear. So storms will be able to rapidly strengthen here like Beryl did. And then very likely chance, this really happens every year no matter what happens. The Gulf Loop is just so warm. And especially this year, you saw it like, that was like the main spot in the Atlantic already where we already have hurricane waters. So very likely chance for tropical storms or just systems in general to rapidly intensify into hurricanes. And depending on the strength, maybe even major hurricanes in the Gulf Loop area. So that warm sea surface temperatures, the Gulf Loop already being so strong and the little shear is going to add to that. But this is really already going to happen. And that leads to my overall tropical cyclone favorability forecast. Above average for the entire Atlantic, clearly. There is colder waters here, so I didn't really think I should have put one here. But then again, tropical cyclones already start to weaken as they get up here due to less water temperatures, like they're less high. Obviously, as you get into the northern tropics and eventually the subtropics up here, waters are much colder. But above average temperatures for the above average favorability for tropical cyclone genesis and strengthening and rapid intensification for the entire Atlantic, especially as you get into like the Leeward Islands and the Northern Caribbean, into the Gulf Loop. We saw very below average here in the climatology models and already very warm temperatures in the Gulf Loop and Northern Caribbean, favoring hurricane conditions. And up here, this darker red is mainly shown by less shear. There's going to be the least shear is probably going to be around this area based on the models, or at least the most below average here. So the sea surface temperatures might not be as warm, but storm formation at least is going to be very favorable here, and some strengthening too. Maybe not rapid intensification, but it's still possible here. Just that's going to be more down here, but still very favorable for storm development and strengthening in this area too. Obviously, it's not as warm yet. The Gulf Stream isn't as warm yet in this area, but definitely it's going to warm. It warms up fast as you get into May, so that it doesn't really mean as much, other than you might not have as rapidly intensifying systems here. But obviously, when they get here, they could have already had a trek across the Atlantic. So really, at that point, it doesn't really matter because they're already strong. But also, we have cases of like storms just forming by the Bahamas and then going towards the Carolinas, or storms going through Florida back towards the Carolinas off the East Coast. So, and what I mean by that is they may do something like this. So really, still favorable, just these areas especially have to watch out. Sorry about that yapping there, but hopefully y'all get the point. Again, now we're going to get into the Bermuda High and tracks. So for peak season, TFS is showing a weaker Bermuda High. Now automatically that just means, storms also trying to go like way out here too. Like way out here, not just like this far. These might be a little too west as well. But basically, what this weaker Bermuda High could do is obviously we're gonna have more eastern tracks too. They're not all gonna be this close to the coast. But then obviously for closer to land impacts, this weaker Bermuda High could have storms going towards Bermuda. They could have them getting really close to the Leeward Islands and Bahamas, maybe getting some impacts to there, depending on, and even the East Coast, depending on really how big the wind field and how strong the system is before becoming extratropical and going towards the before getting extratropical around the Canadian provinces. And then more direct impacts, you'd have storms going through the Leeward Islands, Bahamas, maybe into Florida. So something like into Florida like that before going through the Carolinas and into the Northeast. So first glance, okay, well, we're not going to have a lot of Gulf, but that is not the case. I mean, there's going to be a big East Coast risk there, but I'll show you what I mean. So we do see also for the peak season, we do see above average, like local, obviously below average precipitation for most of the Atlantic, but in some localized areas in the Gulf and in the by the Bahamas. So what that could mean is we could have some like tropical storms pop up, go through here maybe and hit Florida, or go through the Gulf, like go form near the Yucatan into the Central Gulf, form, and then travel a bit before hitting, say, Louisiana, Texas, Florida, wherever. But this is just showing we could have some tropical storms forming, maybe not hurricanes or major hurricanes, but weaker storms forming and hitting the Gulf. But obviously, I'm not saying the Gulf is only going to get weak systems. In fact, that is quite the opposite true, which I'll show later in the video. But I'm just showing, even the climatology models are still showing some risk. Also, I want to touch on this. The above average precipitation here over the Central African coast, Central West African coast, right here where my point arrow is, that means less Saharan dust. So that's going to be even more favorable for systems coming off the coast of Africa. But now we're going to go to Cam Sips, which peak season, obviously a lot of recurves, as we can see here, which is obviously very clear due to the weaker Bermuda High, but also a lot of above average precipitation here. So what that shows is we get a lot of systems tracking through the Caribbean, hitting the Yucatan, maybe Texas, Louisiana, as well as above average precipitation across the southeast shows we could have smaller systems forming in the Gulf by the Yucatan and hitting Florida, or going up the Florida coast and into the Carolinas, or just going into the Carolinas. So definitely, but mainly Texas and Yucatan seems to be the worst risk here. But obviously, as you can see, CanSIPS is showing something for pretty much everywhere. Oops, sorry. Didn't mean to pull up the taskbar. But anyway, obviously, climatology models is not the only and not even the main thing we use to look at land risks. We also have this by WESH, which is like they use winter storm tracks to show where storms could go. And we see a lot by Texas and Yucatan, so that favors a Texas-Yucatan risk, but also lows going towards Florida, so Florida and maybe the Bahamas, east coast of Florida towards the Carolinas. So what that means is they were saying the landfall hotspots, and also they got 85% of landfalls last year, and I think 75% the year before. So this is definitely something to look at, mainly the entire Gulf Coast. I mean, due to the fact that these were kind of scattered, usually they're more specific on landfall hotspots, but they're highlighting the entire Gulf this year. But due to the weaker Bermuda High having systems going up the East Coast, and these lows showing a Gulf hotspot, we could really have systems going everywhere this year. Now, obviously, I'm not going to put on a hotspot for the entire Eastern Gulf Coast. Now, we'll get specifically there now, where we have 27, we're getting to the analogs. 2017, a lot of out-to-sea systems. We have a system going through Florida, major Hurricane Irma, and hitting Florida, giving hurricane conditions to them, and then tropical storm conditions later on. We have a tropical storm hitting Florida. We have a system. We have a system which became a hurricane over the Gulf Loop and hit the Central Gulf, which is why I have an arrow pointing there. And then obviously the tropical storms and a couple tropical storms and a hurricane hitting Texas, Louisiana. So this shows what the CanSIPS was showing, and what WESH was showing is that Western Gulf, Texas, Yucatan hotspot, as well as a lot of recurves and the East Coast too, due to the weaker Bermuda High and the Gulf Loop strengthening a system into the hurricane, which is shown right here. 2023, less landfalls, but a lot of recurves shown. We have a tropical storm hitting the Carolinas, which again shows two things. One, I said how we could have systems coming, forming off the East Coast and hitting the East Coast. That's what we could have here. We have the Gulf Loop strengthening systems, what we could do with Idalia and that western Gulf area that I pointed out right here with this tropical storm. 2013, again, not a lot of systems this year, but a lot of recurves, something for the Gulf. So like I was saying, the TFS was showing above average precipitation in this area, so we could have weaker systems there. So tropical storms, a tropical storm here, even a tropical storm in the Gulf here, and then that Texas Yucatan hotspot is shown there again. 2011, I don't know why this image is always blurry. We have a lot of recurves. We have, again, like I said, CANCIPs showing above average precipitation, like slightly along parts of the Gulf Coast, so weaker systems. That's shown with this tropical storm right here. And then the western Gulf is this really weak tropical storm right here. But still, again, the tropical storm is still significant. Any tropical storm, hurricane, major hurricane, just because it's in a Category 5, tropical storm, major hurricane, all significant. So, obviously, but I hope y'all already knew that. But anyway, then we have the Yucatan, Texas hotspot shown with these systems. We have a hurricane, like about 3 tropical storms, a tropical storm over Louisiana. And then that East Coast hotspot due to the weaker Bermuda High shown by Hurricane Irene right here, which was a hurricane and bring hurricane and tropical storm impacts for the East Coast. But obviously, no matter whether it's a tropical storm, hurricane, major hurricane, treat them all with respect. Stay off the roads. Look at the impacts, because no matter what, it's bad. I mean, that's why we give you warnings and watches and everything. 2006. The Texas hotspot isn't really shown here, but we have, like I said, weaker systems and also just systems in general on the eastern Gulf Coast with this tropical storm right here. And one coming through Cuba, hitting Florida and Carolinas, which is honestly another hotspot I'm going to be noting later on in the video, because, again, we had Irma have a similar track. It wasn't as strong, and it was... I mean, Irma was way stronger, and it initially started more north. But obviously, systems going into the Florida Peninsula, like this tropical storm, and then eventually into the Carolinas, is something we definitely could be seeing. A lot of recurves, though, and then something hitting the Northeast. Again, a higher East Coast risk. 1999, this season had way stronger storms. But what we're seeing here is a lot of recurves, but also a high East Coast risk, like I said, the weaker Bermuda High would cause. We have a tropical storm here, where the rest of these are hurricane. I mean, this hurricane weakened to a tropical storm, and that brings tropical storm impacts to the Northeast. And there was a tropical storm off the coast of the Carolinas, but originally it was still a hurricane. But that weaker Bermuda High is going to bring heightened hurricane impacts, as we see. Again, the one through the Florida Peninsula track, and like I said, systems going to be tracking through the Caribbean. But obviously, this season highlights a higher East Coast risk, multiple hurricane impacts for the East Coast. That Texas Yucatan risk, as we see with the tropical depression down here and that hurricane up right here, and some weaker systems in the Eastern Gulf maybe because of this tropical storm right here. Again, they don't always have to be weak. We had Hurricane Idalia go over the Gulf Loop. I'm just thinking this year, systems over the Gulf Loop will go more west, but I'll touch on that more later in the video. Finally, the final analog, 2008. Again, this goes with WESH's forecast. A lot of Gulf impacts, mainly for the Central Gulf, like I said, and the Western Gulf, like I said here. That Texas Yucatan impact was 2 tropical storms right here, and that tropical storm later becoming a hurricane for Texas. Again, those warm Gulf waters, a tropical storm out here too. Multiple hurricane impacts and tropical storm impacts for the Gulf. And again, that Florida Peninsula track, a tropical storm there. And then 2 hurricane impacts, one for Texas and one for Louisiana, and then a tropical storm here in the Gulf. So definitely weaker systems, as well as some systems becoming stronger over the Gulf Loop for the Gulf. And then again, with all these recurves, we also have some tropical storm impacts. We have a tropical storm here hitting the Carolinas and then going through the Northeast before becoming extratropical up here. And then another tropical storm, not making landfall, but giving definitely tropical storm impacts to the Carolinas, because how close it is. Now, before we go to the landfall forecast, we have to know a lot of those systems were only tropical storms, and they were a while ago. They were in the AMO cold phase. But we have to remember the temp, and also a lot of those years didn't have as much landfalls, besides like say 2008, which had a lot. But so it's important to note that due to, again, it's later on, sea surface temperatures are warmer, and also just warmer sea surface temperatures and forecasts, we're going to have more systems, which can mean more landfalls, because some of those seasons were not that active. They only had like 10 tropical storms. But because of this warmer sea surface temperatures, we could be having more tropical cyclones, more tropical storms, as well as stronger systems. So a lot of those analogs only had like tropical storm landfalls. It could be major hurricane landfalls, because of how warm the sea surface temperatures are, and also or maybe just more landfalls in general due to the warmer sea surface temperatures and forecast so far. And that's further backed up here by these, again, more hurricane. Again, this is the image I showed you earlier, but more hurricane waters favoring higher chances of hurricanes going towards the Gulf and East Coast because of how warm they are, and also just the warmer waters in general, making it easier for systems to form. So before actually going to my landfall forecast, I'm just pointing these out again to show, due to the abundance of hurricane favorable waters and the warmer than forecast waters, we could be having more landfalls, first of all, and also stronger landfalls, and also just more active seasons as opposed to what the analog showed. Anyway, this is not my landfall forecast. This is not showing your risk of being hit by a system. This is just saying how strong could your impacts be if you got hit, based on how favorable the water and shear are by you. So how strong that system could be and give you impacts. Again, this is more experimental, but due to that Carolina hotspot and a lot of those hurricanes hitting the Carolinas, in the analogs we have a major hurricane spot over there. Same for Louisiana and Texas due to the Gulf Loop. Tropical storm for most of Florida due to those weaker tropical storms. And same for the Yucatan, because a lot of those systems only were tropical storms when they hit the Yucatan, but they strengthened over the Bay of Campeche, which is why I put a hurricane risk here. Same for the Leeward Islands. They might not have fully their act together before they get there. So I'm thinking mainly a tropical storm risk for the Leeward Islands. And a hurricane risk for the Bahamas and the Caribbean, because for landfalls, because of, again, as we saw in this graphic right here, very warm waters there. But whether you're in a tropical storm or major hurricane risk, definitely something to watch. Again, mainly looking at the landfalls, hotspots from this graphic is not what we're doing. This is just showing where how strong systems could be depending on where you go. Obviously, up here, it's only going to be tropical storm due to weaker systems. I mean, Hurricane Irene was an exception, but I do not think we'll see something like that again. And again, even if you're just in a weak tropical storm, it's like Florida, again, even if it's just a tropical storm, it's still bad. It still cancels school work. You still have to stay home. Flooding, winds, bad. Again, not my landfall forecast yet, but this is a risk compared to last year. Blue is lower, red is higher. Over the past 2 years, this part of Florida has gotten 3 hurricanes, 2 of which have been major. So I don't really see a feasible way that it's going to be any higher this year. Definitely lower due to the weaker Bermuda High. But definitely, again, if the system goes through the Gulf Loop and actually goes more east than I expect, then definitely something in here. Now, while the risk is lower, we could have some tropical storms going through the area based on the analogs, and maybe even stronger, but we'll see. It just depends on the sea surface temperatures. But definitely those weaker systems, more pop-up systems, tropical storms going to be a risk to this area. And again, I'm not saying every system in this area, if they get some, are going to be just a tropical storm. Again, tropical storms are bad, but again, with the Gulf Loop, it can be very unpredictable. And by Cuba and stuff, I'm expecting a lower risk than last year just because of the amount of systems that have tracked through here, and such as like Beryl that have tracked near here, but definitely still a high risk. Texas to Louisiana, you saw the amount of landfalls in the analogs we got, so definitely a high risk here. Same for Carolinas, you saw the amount of systems that hit the Carolinas and went up the East Coast, And obviously the Yucatan, because the systems have to go through the Yucatan before getting to the Western Gulf. And a lot of these, and again, the systems like that went up into the Florida Peninsula obviously also went through the Bahamas, the Leeward Islands, Puerto Rico, and such. That's why I have a higher risk compared to there. So official landfall hotspots and some likely tracks. This is my official landfall hotspots. So the Leeward Islands, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, parts of Mexico, Texas, and the Carolinas are my highest risks due to just the fact that we could have hurricanes and major hurricanes this year because of the warm sea surface temperatures. So stronger systems and just more numerous systems due to pretty much every analog showed a system for each of these areas. And these red areas are secondary hotspots. The Yucatan, most of the analog showed systems going through the Yucatan, but they're really weak, and honestly, they were only like 40 miles an hour, which is strong and brings a lot of wind and rain. But because it's more unpredictable, I'm going to keep them at a lower risk because they weren't really shown getting like major hurricanes. But again, tropical storm, major hurricane, any risk is bad. Again, we had some analogs going through Louisiana, Cuba. Most showed Florida, so we're going to keep them out of red. And then due to those unpredictable tropical storms and hurricanes that maybe form through the Yucatan, go through Florida, or just form in the middle of the Gulf, go through Florida, we keep them at a notable risk this year and the Northeast because of the amount of systems that track through the area. But because they are farther north, it's harder to predict for them. More potential tracks. These colors, the red and white, there's no difference in them. It's just easier to see it unless I made them like all white. So again, we had some Bay of Campeche storms, like in our 2013 analog Hurricane Ingrid, which was a hurricane that just formed in the Bay of Campeche. So something like that. Again, those Gulf systems that go through Florida and then through the Carolinas, that's one of them. Systems that like Hurricane Irene, which go through the Northeast, and then just out-to-sea systems, obviously, like seen here, like these out-to-sea systems, definitely going to be seeing this year. And then again, like systems going through the Gulf Loop and hitting the Central Gulf, systems that went through Florida, and systems like that form off the coast of the Carolinas, so that's what we could be seeing this year. So can I move this? Okay, there we go. Key takeaways from, by the way, I'm going to try to wrap this up because this video is getting quite long. But anyway, key takeaways from this video: higher sea surface temperatures, low shear, high tropical cyclone generous favorability. That is also due to way less Saharan dust, which is going to favor tropical cyclone development and strengthening. A weaker Bermuda high risk of landfalls for many areas. Texas and Carolinas are at the highest risk. Rapid intensification likely for some systems, and that also leads to a heightened major hurricane risk. Also just a heightened hurricane risk in general. And many weaker landfalls possible in addition to the heightened hurricane and major hurricane risk. Honestly, my idea of a major hurricane is not only does it bring major hurricane impacts, but also it just brings a larger area of hurricane impacts to many places. Now, obviously, whether you're in the Bahamas, Florida, Louisiana, everything, everywhere is at a risk of somewhat this year. But obviously, I've already went over which areas have the highest risk for those stronger systems. But I know I say weaker landfalls. Whether you're in the Bahamas getting a tropical storm or Texas getting a major hurricane, whatever happens this year, if you're getting a tropical cyclone, whether it's a 40 mile per hour tropical storm or a 150 mile per hour Category 4, it is still a tropical cyclone. The wind and rain and flooding is still going to be bad, and you need to treat the cyclone with respect. You need to take proper precautions. So, my first official hurricane season forecast for 2025, we're going to go with 18 named storms, which is from the range of 15 to 21. 9 hurricanes, so half of those will become hurricanes, which comes from the range of 7 to 10 hurricanes. So average is 14, so our range starts just above the average. And the average is 7 hurricanes, so that starts at the average. And then five of those hurricanes will become major hurricanes. So we start just above the average of the range of 4 to 6 here. So obviously, we're expecting an above average season across the board. 18 named storms, a lot of those are going to become hurricanes, and a lot of those are going to become major hurricanes. In fact, I'm expecting most of the hurricanes to become major hurricanes. But whether you're getting a named storm hurricane or a major hurricane, it is something to watch out for. This is up from our previous forecast. on February 1st, which is 13 to 16 named storms, 6 to 9 hurricanes, and 2 to 4 major hurricanes. So that was actually more below average across the board. But again, due to the amount of new analogs that have come out and just the sea surface temperatures warming up so fast, and like you saw those graphs where the AMO is way warmer than expected, that's just obviously I had to push the numbers way up. So finally, our overview of most to all of what I've said in the video. Tons of activity across the Atlantic, and due to that weaker Bermuda high, there's going to be tons of fish storms. Many landfalls and impacts, such as Texas, the Gulf, the Florida Panhandle and the Eastern Gulf, the Florida Peninsula up to the Carolinas, and even up to the Northeast, and then obviously the Yucatan and Cuba. So this is a general, and obviously like the Bahamas. This is a generalization of who's going to get the most landfalls, but it's just showing we're going to get more landfalls potentially than usual, or at least in this general area. Again, more specific maps were earlier in the video. Rapid intensification for the Gulf Loop really happens every year for a lot of systems, but we're going to be watching that very closely. And the final thing of the video is, where will we see the first named storm of this season? So tropical storm, obviously. Early to mid-May, potentially. We've had some signals in April. Obviously, I'm not expecting anything in April, but as we get into May, that could be more likely. I mean, models don't go for that far out, but usually we can see systems spinning up out near the Azores, out in the Atlantic, but also closer to the coast, especially near Florida, the Bahamas, and the Carolinas, which is why there's a dark red. So maybe just like a tropical storm to start out the year potentially. I remember one year we had for 2020. I remember, dang, that was 5 years ago. I feel old, but we had a system. This wasn't the exact route, but it came up near the Carolinas, and then we had a system go through Florida. I mean, it was actually extra. It wasn't actually tropical. I think it was like extra tropical until it got past Florida, which is actually very unusual. So that's like rare for for it to not be tropical until past Florida. But either way, we're going to be watching this area into May as models will start to pick up on more signals that we could be seeing. So first named storm of the season, Florida, Carolinas, maybe out in the season, we'll see, but this is where the areas I think we could see it. Anyway, this video has been over 40 minutes long. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. Again, whether you're in a tropical storm, hurricane, or major hurricane, you got to watch out for everything. And obviously, depending on the strength of the storm, those tropical storm and even hurricane conditions can go very far inland. But again, I can't really forecast that because how far inland it goes, that's more cold fronts, speed of the storm, what's going on. That's day-to-day weather. I cannot forecast that from this far out. But again, whether it's a tropical storm, hurricane, or major hurricane, you have to treat it from respect. Whether it's, again, borderline tropical storm to Category 5. Again, I keep repeating this because people like to say how tropical storms aren't that bad, but like, no matter what, it's bad. So I have to keep reiterating this. So I hope y'all know that. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. And yeah, bye.